Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Cynthia, and thank you to the organizing team of the eDARE conference for the opportunity to share. I have made amendments to my original topic, so now it reads as Liberation as Praxis, Poverty, Theology, Movements, and Development. Okay, so try and move. So the paper attempts to argue that liberation is a process of praxis. And I will use the three-prong approach to try and frame my presentation in this paper. I used denunciation, annunciation, and transformation as the frame for the presentation. First, I want to preface this presentation by acknowledging the work that was done by Paulo Freire on the notion of praxis, as well as Gustavo Gutierrez on the notion of liberation. And I'm using both concepts to try and frame what I call liberation as a process of praxis. In this paper, I am using the work of Tom Moylan and Lyndon West, who offers conceptual resources for engaging liberation as a process of praxis. So according to Moylan and Lyndon West, there are two important concepts for reflection on liberation as praxis. They both proposes denunciation and annunciation as two important processes that frame the discussion around issues of liberation and praxis. Moylan argues that these concepts can be used to advance a liberatory utopian vision and require participation in the process of social change. And for Moylan, denunciation is a rejection of the order or a system that is considered to be an oppressive system. And this oppressive system requires change in it for it to be able to engage with the system that is an alternative to the current world order. So denunciation is a rejection of the status quo in terms of an oppressive system. Moylan further postulates that annunciation is a reformation of the world system order or the provision of an alternative system to the oppressed world order. That is Moylan's articulation and explanation of these two concepts. For Lyndon West, these concepts provide resources to recover Paulo Freire's dialogical popular education praxis. Denunciation for Lyndon West refers to the critique and the fundamental questioning of the system world order. Whereas for Lyndon West, annunciation means the role of love and affirmation of the other. Example, the marginalized working class poor, Black working class poor in the African context, for instance, the LGBTQ, the women who are marginalized by patriarchy. That is the affirmation of the other, which is the marginalized and the susceptible to the forces of oppression. So in this paper, I use Tom Moylan and Lyndon West's concepts then to provide a framework for discussing liberation as a process of praxis. Now, I use a three-pronged approach to do this. First, I use denunciation to talk about what I refer to as ideological reflection, which is a denunciation of structural poverty and oppression. Secondly, I use annunciation to talk about the importance of theological reform, a paradigm shift from what the Kairos document refers to as church and state theology to a prophetic public liberation theology. And finally, I use transformation as a point of departure to argue that dialogical resistance through the building of movements and participatory community development lead into transformation. So this is how I use the two concepts and the transformation as a point of departure. Denunciation in this case is an ideological term that I use to present what the organized groups in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, have presented as issues and social issues that they need to be liberated from. Because one of the questions that was raised by the eDARE conference was, what do people need to be liberated from? Because before we have liberation, we need to know what people need to be liberated from. And one of the slogans that was presented by the ANC in 1994 was a better life for all. And this was political rhetoric that dominated the political discourse and had the propensity to romanticize about people's reality. So ideological reflection is reflecting on this slogan and whether or not the people's lives have been changed for the better. And the focus group discussions from the four groups, that is Miezana, Masipeke Pambili, Sakingo Muso, and Ingukugo. These are the community organized based groups. They rejected outright this idea that there is a better life for all. And they argued vehemently that structural poverty is a result of this political rhetoric by the ANC of a better life for all, which is not true, because it's a better life for the few and not a better life for all. So I am arguing that the better life for all is not a better life for all, but a better life for the few. And therefore, this structure that has produced a better life for the few must be rejected. Secondly, is annunciation, which is now theological. And here I'm arguing for a public prophetic liberation theology. And I'm asking the question, what is the role of public prophetic liberation theology in a post-colonial context? We have achieved what might be referred to as political emancipation, but what we have not achieved is socio-economic liberation, which remains an elusive concept in our context in the South African public. Therefore, there is a need for a theology that engages with the socio-economic challenges and the socio-economic ills that still persist unabated in our context. But what we have seen is a lack of a voice of a public prophetic liberation theology that is radical, that challenges the status quo in terms of socio-economic emancipation. But what we have also witnessed is a return into the public discourse of what the Kairos document refers to as church and state theologies. And therefore, the critical question is, where are the prophets of our contemporary context who can articulate a public prophetic theology, a public prophetic liberation theology that engages with the status quo and disrupt and deconstruct the status quo? That is the theology that I am calling for and looking for and advocating for. A theology that is radical, prophetic, and public, and looking at liberation as an important concept to deal with issues of structural poverty that persist in our context. Last but not least, transformation, which is a dialogical concept that I'm using, which brings together already organized social as well as religious movements into a dialogue. And these social movements come into a dialogue, and therefore, as a result of engaging in a reflective dialogue, they are therefore able to formulate the basis from which to develop communities, because they are participating in this dialogue. They are not invited into a dialogue, but they are active agents of this dialogue, and therefore they are able to build each and every member that participates in these processes. And as a result of that, people themselves participate in their own development. And this is not a top-down type of development, but it's a bottom-up type of development, which is people-centered, as David Cotton would argue, that the option for a people-centered development is building movements. In our context, we have some movements that are still in operation, but some have collapsed for a number of reasons. Therefore, there's a need to strengthen existing movements, but also build those who have collapsed, so that we build this critical and dialogical resistance that can facilitate a process of participatory community development. Finally, I conclude by saying that liberation is not an event, but liberation is an ongoing process of praxis, which requires interaction between the scholars, the trained readers in our context, and organic intellectuals to engage in a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue that will lead to a resistance of oppressive forces. Liberation as a praxis is ideological, theological, and dialogical. And finally, liberation as a praxis requires a collaborative praxis. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. And thank you, Sithembiso and Anna, for your challenging, thought-provoking papers. And I know you're both accomplished scholars. And I must say that Anna did send me her paper a few days ago. And that helped. I will explain again today that my own context, besides just the geographical context of being from Southern Africa, studying in the Netherlands, is also that I am a biblical scholar. My PhD research is on the New Testament, and it's challenging to hear your perspective. So I'll start with Sithembiso, and I think what I would like to do again is just to look at the triggers for me from Sithembiso's presentation, and this links already to some of the things that he spoke about in the joint paper yesterday. So I like this new, I was thinking the new steps that you have in liberation as praxis, the denunciation, annunciation, and then I think actually when you get to the dialogical resistance process, because my interest, my reflection was on, yesterday I asked the question about who is community when we do conceptual Bible study. And I realize in today's presentation that you speak about including the community, the social movements in the community. Now, what could be a question for me is who are the trained Bible readers and the organic scholars? What is the difference between them? Because I was the disenfranchised, the structurally poor, do they have a space there? Do they have are they able to influence outcomes and what goes on in the liberation process? And I appreciate that, especially when we talk of liberation and praxis, at least it's not just liberation in theory. It's good that there's reflection and praxis, reflection and praxis, and that continues. So that was my concern. I was wondering about that, and I think it's in my own research. For example, when I study the Gospel of Matthew, there's always that, and I study it in its ancient context. There's always the question of, for example, some scholars like Dennis Dooling speak of the marginal scribal leadership in the Gospel of Matthew. And there's always that tension of the people who do the liberation, who could be scholars in our time, and the academics and the theologians are in this border space, in this in the margins, but different margins, because they are on the margins of the majority, the masses, the poor, but I think they are also on the margins of the elite and the powerful. And there's always a question in my mind on whose interests do they serve, and how do they negotiate this space?